So I'm Matt. I do marketing and community for Rocket Pool, and this is our weekly community call Twitter space. We've got Jasper hosting this time around and joined by a special guest. If you haven't seen the tweet about this space, there's a number of acronyms, most of which I recognize, and a slightly smaller number that I fully understood. So I think it's going to be a really interesting and informational Twitter space, potentially lots to discuss. Potentially the space could go on for hours and hours. We don't intend to cover so much in the way of protocol updates. Usually at the end of one of these Twitter spaces, we do cover what's been happening in the Rocket Pool ecosystem. As per usual, there is a lot going on, but at the same time, we and the team are preparing to attend Singapore, which is keeping us pretty busy. And as I just said, there's potentially a lot of interesting topics to talk about. So that will be our main focus today. If anyone has any questions or comments, I'll be monitoring, of course, the trading channel in the Rocket Pool Discord, and also replies to the space here on Twitter/X. And with that out of the way, I'm going to hand over to Jasper to host this call.
Thanks, Mav. Excited for the team to be headed to Singapore. And if anyone's listening going to Singapore, make sure you reach out and let the team know. So today we do have a very special call. I am joined by the well-known and well-respected Hasu, who's had a storied career on Ethereum starting back probably even before 2020. That's the earliest I have followed them since, with their podcast, Uncommon Core. From there, they've worked with MKR, Lido, and most importantly and most notably, I think, Flashbots. So Hasu, would you like to give us a little bit of perhaps a timeline of your Ethereum or crypto career and some of the places you've worked at?
Sure, Jasper. Hi, thanks. It's good to be here. So my Ethereum career, I would say, started in 2019, 2020. I had been in crypto for a few years prior, but working pretty much exclusively on Bitcoin. Mostly, I was very interested in kind of mining economics and already, in fact, thinking about MEV back in Bitcoin land. Now, from the perspective of Ethereum, we would say there isn't really any MEV in Bitcoin. But I did write a paper that kind of tried to formalize money that an attacker can make from reordering the chain or censoring, etc. And tried to kind of formalize a security model around that. And what really turned me towards Ethereum was, on the one side, what I thought kind of is, the like intellectual staleness of the Bitcoin community, and kind of how difficult it is really to discuss, ideas there, that, the protocol might not be perfect, that, it might have to be changed in some way, or, I think that was and that's not just my singular experience. I would say I think that's an experience that's shared by many, that working on Bitcoin is very difficult, and kind of you have to kind of chew glass there for a long time. And what turned me really to Ethereum was seeing the first DeFi applications pop up. To me, that really showed, wow, Ethereum is real. And there's a lot of interesting things that you can build on it. At this time, I also started to realize the strength of the community, as Ethereum, I think, in the bear market of 2018-19 went down 95%, sub $100, I think, like even in the 60s or something.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And when the Ethereum community kind of pulled through and actually came out stronger on the other end, that really gave me a ton of respect. And for me, it was kind of the culmination of those things that really made me put all my focus on Ethereum from 2020 and onwards.
Amazing. Yeah, the early Bitcoin days, especially, were dry of MEV and mainly most DeFi activity. And Ethereum had to take up that mantle, and it came with a trade-off. And so we have this topic, this concept called MEV, or miner maximal extractable value. Before we jump into this next section where we talk about the history of MEV, so to speak, do you have any mental models that you like to use when thinking about MEV? Personally, it's not a perfect analogy, but I often find myself when I'm stuck in motor vehicle traffic to think about traffic and human patterns as like a very rudimentary form of MEV. People trying to get in and out of lanes faster than each other, often taking advantage of information asymmetries. So I'm wondering if you have any helpful frameworks for thinking about it.
Yeah, Jasper, I think you're really onto something there, because I think at least along very similar lines, right? So I think that most people probably view MEV as way too narrow, right? When you already start with, oh, well, there's like front running, oh, and there's back running, and there's symmetry and whatnot, right? I think you have to start from a much higher place, which for me, you can think of MEV as all about power. So MEV is basically the study of how power is distributed in complex systems and what outcomes this uneven distribution of power enables. And in the second step, it is then about taking these learnings and building systems that are more fair and more egalitarian for participants than before. And when you apply this lens, then you can spot MEV actually everywhere in society, right? You can spot it in traffic, you can spot it in business, you can spot it in healthcare, you can spot it virtually everywhere, right? Because everywhere power is unevenly distributed, and those who have more, they can use this power to kind of create better outcomes for themselves. And I think MEV is only more prominent in crypto for two reasons. One is because we are actively shining the spotlight on it here. The study of MEV, I think, originated in crypto, and that's why we are paying a lot of attention to it. But second, also because many roles in crypto are permissionless. Right? So a validator is permissionless, a block builder is permissionless, a liquidator permissionless. We kind of have this idea that we want to design distributed permissionless networks, and many of these roles should be fillable by anyone in the world without permission. And so if one party can do a certain job better than another, let that be, making blocks on Ethereum, then they will quickly crowd out everyone else who's doing a worse job, and they will start to dominate. And there is a reason, I think, why when talking about MEV in crypto, we have been primarily focused on MEV at the validator layer. And that is because MEV can be a real centralizing force on the validator set. And the decentralization of the validator set is a really fundamental property to defend. So if you lose that, then you actually lose a lot of things that are built on top of it.
Yeah, that's a very nice summary of a way of thinking about MEV. In the TradFi world, MEV exists, but it's much less spoken about, and the governments try to regulate it out of relevance, so to speak. Whereas in permissionless systems like we're trying to build with Ethereum, we can't let these social interventions be the end-all be-all. We have to design the systems from the ground up, being aware of these mechanisms, which brings us into the next topic I want to discuss, which is sort of the brief timeline of MEV, because it's changed quite a bit. The way people engage in markets on Ethereum has changed a lot. So if we start early on with the around EIP 1559 system, we had public gas auction. And so many people, if you've been around, remember that Ethereum on occasion would just become unusable. The gas prices would spike into the 3,000 to 4,000 Gwei range. And often this was because of people trying to outbid each other and get into slots to extract MEV. As you mentioned earlier, on Ethereum, it's usually the validators, or currently in the less complex system, validators that have the power to commit blocks in order and therefore extract value. So in this era, we had people clogging the chain with higher and higher transaction bids to try to get priority. And then came along MEV-Geth. So could you talk a little bit about this era, this transition point from public gas auctions into the very first side cart application?
Sure. So MEV has actually been around in Ethereum for a long time. So there's been MEV in CryptoKitties, from breeding and also front running different trades. And already back in ICO days, there are examples. I think there's a famous example of the status ICO, I believe it is, where a mining pool kind of broke the unspoken agreement of miners not to mess with kind of the transaction ordering in Ethereum. And they just bought, pretty much the entire allocation to that like anticipated ICO. And this was really a watershed moment, I think, for many, because it showed, not just like we have known for some time that miners have this power, but somehow, for some reason, they just like didn't touch it until now. And then, this watershed moment happened, and it became clear. Yeah.
I believe we saw the same thing with ordinals. The first Bitcoin MEV, so to speak, was the sort of MEV or this NFT based thing. I just thought that was interesting. Sorry to interrupt. Continue.
No, I mean, I agree. And this is nowadays you would, much more expect that, right? I think in a system where maybe MEV extraction is not so rampant, like Bitcoin, it's maybe more interesting, I think, when it happens, because it's like one party basically like tearing down, like quote unquote shelling fence and like doing something that's like out of the ordinary. But then once they did, the equilibrium changes, right? And then now like everybody pretty much has to extract MEV to remain competitive.
Right.
So we had MEV in ICOs, we had MEV in CryptoKitties, we had MEV even back on the first Ethereum decentralized exchange called Ether Delta, where people could do arbitrage, they could front run trades and all of these things. And Phil DeYan, actually, like one of the co-founders of Flashbots, actually wrote a paper about this that basically kind of founded or like formalized the idea of MEV. It's called Flashboys 2.0, in reference to Flash Boys, the famous book about basically the like latency wars at Wall Street, the high frequency trading game. And this kind of, this was in 2019, and it kind of really put MEV on the map. A year later, in 2020, Flashbots was founded. And at this time, I think it was kind of founded with the idea to kind of, really prevent centralization of the validator layer from, or not validator, because we were still in like the mining era back then, but prevent the consensus layer of Ethereum from centralization, right? So for one, we had all of these things that we talked about. We had already, more and more miners and searchers becoming active in MEV, and at least one mining pool, like one very major mining pool, was working very actively on creating their own kind of proprietary MEV system. And that's when the founders, like the now founders of Flashbots, realized, something has to be done. Like, we can't allow this to be developed in, behind closed doors and only available to very specific mining pools. What we need is an open system. And that really motivated the creation then in January 2021 of MEV-Geth, which is it's basically a relay service to receive bundles from searchers and forward them to mining pools in order to democratize MEV. And for mining pools, this was really, it was a very simple patch to adopt, and it was also trustless. Because basically, like what this like second client did is it just like it allowed them to profit switch, between the block that they could build from the public mempool and one that also included, searcher transactions. And so they would only basically use the searcher transactions if it was actually more profitable. And more profitable it was. And so within 3 months, I think, this new sidecar client reached 90% adoption from mining pools, which this is something that I think surprised many in crypto, because mining pools were often based in China or in other locations, and they were seen as not very cooperative and not very reachable in many ways, or approachable. And then when kind of so many different mining pools basically all kind of adopt the same system in a short period of time, I think it was it made it clear that MEV is real and MEV is here to stay.
It also.
Mm-hmm.
It also.
Yeah, I realized.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I just wanted to add that it made Flashbots the first of a new category of things where historically all upgrades to Ethereum ecosystem were either on the app layer or through the EIP process. We just had the first sort of mass adoption upgrade that was not done by sort of like the Ethereum community directly, so to speak. It was a new process, and the speed at which that happened, I think, definitely threw some people for a loop. And Vitalik once wrote a paper much later about the story of Flashbots and how the upgrade to that system was different from the rest. So the inception of that being so rapid, I think, was very important in showing how robust the Ethereum community was. So we had this transition to MEVGeth and these original ideas from the Flashbots team to democratize access to MEV for the sake of the beacon chain. And I think that was very prescient and sort of spoke to the values that Flashbots would later go on to reveal with open sourcing a lot of their technology. So can you talk a bit about that? The next steps forward from MEVGeth to MEVBoost, and sort of sticking to that ideal of open sourcing technology.
Yeah, sure. And do you want me to just comment on kind of the transition also from priority gas auctions, kind of what changed between that and MEV Geth?
Yeah. Just because if you were there, it was like a night and day, literally transition on change for everything. Gas prices plummeted and stability increased quite a bit. So yeah, if you could add a little bit on that.
Yeah, so before Flashbots released MEV Geth, MEV extraction would basically happen to what Jasper already said, basically a mechanism called priority gas auctions. And that was basically a way for searchers to kind of express their preferences about the priority and placement of their transactions through the gas price, and then submit them to the public mempool. Right? And oftentimes, these transactions would be publicly visible, and so one searcher would see the transaction of another searcher in the public mempool, and they would one-up them. And so it would go back and forth. And this had kind of a few problems, right? So the first problem, both for searchers and for kind of users of the chain and for validators, in fact, was that it's what we call an all-pay auction. So in an all-pay auction, all bids, even the unsuccessful ones, have to pay a fee and get included on chain. And this was this was bad for the searchers who were bidding, because they have to bid less because they have to factor in the risk when the transaction fails. But also for users, because for them it was bad because as Jasper was alluding to, some of the block space actually went to these failed bids instead of being available for real users of Ethereum. The second problem was that searchers, as I was saying, they try to express their preferences across two dimensions. One is about the priority of their transaction. So how much is it worth to them for this transaction to be included? And then the second is the placement of the transaction in the block relative to other transactions. And in the mempool days, they had to express this preference, this two-dimensional preference, in a single dimension, which was the gas price. And for top of block auctions, that was fine because it was simply a matter of outbidding everyone else. But whenever you wanted, for example, to bid on placement relative to another transaction that paid, let's say 100 gray, then if you wanted to be placed before it, then you would bid 99.9 gray, and if you wanted to be placed after it, you would bid 100 dot one gray. So it's basically trying to exploit this ordering mechanism of the miner, or trying to basically like work with this ordering mechanism of the miner that would simply order by gas price. And so MathGAF basically changed both of these things. So it created a new transaction type that is called the bundle. That's pretty much now, let's say in many ways, it's not the dominant transaction type on Ethereum in the sense that all transactions go through it. I believe it should be around like 10, 15, maybe 20% of transactions on Ethereum that kind of go through, the bundle transaction type.
Wow.
But
wow.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, can you hear me again?
Yeah. I was just saying wow at the amount of dominance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Continue.
Yeah, but it's 15 to 20% of the number of transactions, but it's over 90% of the value of transactions that go through the bundle type. Yeah. So it's kind of really an insane number, right? Because MVP transactions tend to be so much more valuable than regular transactions. So the bundle type, it kind of, and the Flashbots auction at large, it had a few big differences. One was changing kind of the nature of the auction, away from an all-pay auction where the transactions and the bids of everyone else was transparent, to a sealed bid auction. So, one bidder could not see actually what another is bidding, and failed transactions would, neither be included. So there was no cost for miners, and also kind of the residual transactions that did not win in the auction, they would also not be disclosed to kind of protect the privacy of the searchers.
That's a huge change compared to the status quo where on Ethereum, transactions would sit in the mempool and leak information to people who are watching. Yeah,
exactly. So in the PGA days, it was basically, for searchers, the auction was very hostile in a sense. It was very much about, latency and, just being kind of the last to submit. There was actually and just to give a fun anecdote, there was a time when, Go Ethereum would, which was the dominant client at the time, would have a transaction ordering policy that was based on randomness. So it would basically take, the seen transactions, and then would randomize, between the ones that it has seen at the same time. And so this actually led to an enormous amount of spam from searchers, and it would kind of like quickly, led to a change in the client, and then it became kind of based on first seen. That made it kind of, a latency game, if you will, between the different searchers. So the last change that I would highlight between the public mempool and the Flashbots auction was the fact that when, for example, as a searcher, you wanted to make several transactions, or kind of let's take for example in the sandwich attack, a searcher would have to place a transaction before and after a user transaction. And in the public mempool, it's not guaranteed that the execution of these trades is actually atomic. So maybe your first transaction gets in, but your second doesn't, right? And then that's actually really bad because you made a really inefficient trade.
Right.
And yeah, you could get really kind of exploited for doing that. And what the bundle also did is it allows you to submit not just a single transaction, but an array of transactions. So several transactions following each other sequentially. And then it would only execute the bundle if all transactions in the bundle would execute successfully. Right? So there was no more risk for a searcher, for one leg of their strategy, to execute, but not another. There was a big change. And now you could, and oftentimes kind of when I explain this part, I kind of get the argument, okay, but isn't this very bad for Ethereum? The fact that sandwich attacks became easier. And the answer is on some level, yes, but on another level, no. And I think the second level is more important, which is miners already had the ability to make sandwich attacks trustless and hence much more profitable. And if you didn't give searchers in an open system the same ability to do these quote unquote trustless sandwich attacks, then what would happen is basically the mining pools themselves would do them in a proprietary way and the outcome would be the same. And so it was basically, choosing between kind of, a bad situation that is, open and decentralized and choosing between, the same bad situation, but kind of have it, closed and proprietary. And so there wasn't a real choice here what to do about sandwich attacks. It was just about building a system that would mitigate the incentive for these mining pools to vertically integrate.
Personally, I don't find the idea that sandwich attacks and MEV in general is negative or net negative. It's sort of like a bag of water. You can try to like push it around, but the water just moves. MEV is sort of inherent to any financial activity, especially when you have a lack of atomicity, time delays built into the process. So yeah, I do empathize with that position of building it in the open in a way that we can observe is going to keep things more equitable than letting it go to the mining pools. And the nature of bundles, I believe, also enabled flash loans and I suppose one type of negative MFV, which is exploits, but that is a whole different conversation. It's not so much Flashbot's fault. The exploit would still happen. It's just a slightly bit more efficient for that end user. So we have a lot of benefits coming out of MEV-Geth, is the ability to bundle transactions, closed bid auctions instead of open, everything. And now I'm wondering how we get into the PBS era, sort of the modernized, closer to the modern system where, as you've alluded to before, in MEV-Geth, we already have the builder and searcher. So I'm wondering what changes from MEV-Geth to MEV-Boost, and is there any functional change there?
Yeah. So in by kind of mid of 2021, the Flashbots relay had 90% plus adoption from mining pools. The last thing before MEV Boost that I would highlight here is the release of Flashbots Protect in October 2021. Right. So what basically Flashbots Protect did and still does today is it gives this ability to use the Flashbots auction and to use this great new transaction type of the bundle to really every user. Right? So it's basically an endpoint that lets anyone take a regular Ethereum transaction and wrap it as a bundle and forward it to Flashbots, and that allows people to transact with the same guarantees that any searcher had as well. So that's privacy, and that's basically revert protection for their trades. So this is really the main guarantees that users care about. And most, if not all, kind of power users of decentralized exchanges and kind of the more sophisticated DeFi users all use Flashbots Protect or kind of similar private mempool services for that reason.
I believe CowSwap was another that starts offering it.
So CowSwap is something that we may get to, I think, because it's really kind of the first application that really kind of put the idea of intents on the map. And they also use Flashbots Protect and kind of private mempools, but it's only a small part of kind of what makes their experience, like what makes their product really kind of ahead of its time and kind of really magical. So in November 2021, Flashbots together with the Ethereum Foundation, released the spec for MEV Boost. And that's kind of, the original design of Flashbots, but reimagined for the proof of stake era. And so it wasn't clear when proof of stake was going to ship. It was suspected / hoped to ship in 2022. Proof of stake was quite different from proof of work in a few ways. So the main, like for one, it required basically complete like reconstruction of the system, but it was also very different in the sense that there was no more concept of mining pools, right? So in proof of work days, anybody could be a miner, and they would connect to a mining pool, and then the mining pool would be in charge of the block construction. And then they would send, the hashed block header to, these, mining pool members, and they would basically do the hashing on it. And so you already had a natural division of labor there between someone, makes the block and someone else basically works on the block and tries to add some weight to it. And this really didn't exist in the proof of stake design. So every validator was supposed to run their own node and build blocks locally. And I mean, if you kind of followed the history of MEV and what happened, up until this point, then it's quite clear that this could never work, right? Because building blocks in the era of MEV was a very sophisticated activity, and if you didn't have a way to get the most valuable block to all of these validators, then what you would get is basically a lot of centralization on the validator layer. And so basically the Flashbots auction was kind of reimagined for the proof of stake era, and this was called MEV Boost. And it differs mainly in two ways from the previous era of MEV Geth, which the first is that you needed some way to make the system trustless for validators. So in the previous era, the mining pools were basically trusted parties. They could see all of the transactions, and then they would de facto, through the hashing, kind of encrypt it for the workers. And this was not optimal, but it was acceptable because there was only a handful of mining pools, and they had a lot at stake, quote unquote, right? Because if kind of Flashbots suspected them of cheating, then we could punish them, and this served for a while, at least to keep them in line. But with validators, there's way more of them, and they don't have an identity at stake. It's kind of much more difficult, right? And so it was clear that whatever system exists, it must be encrypted for the validator. And so the way that MEV Boost handles this is it introduces another party that's called the relay. And what the relay does, basically, it only shows the block header to the validator. And the block header basically contains the information that the validator needs to see, such as how much will this block pay me? And then they can sign the block header with their signature, and then the full body basically gets released. And that's what allows all validators to trustlessly participate in MEV Boost. The second is, while kind of in the previous era, mining pools could connect to a single block builder, which was Flashbots, which then connected them to many searchers. In MEV Boost, we wanted to make the market structure itself, much more open and egalitarian. And we achieved this by kind of making MEV Boost, not just a multiplexer between kind of different searcher bundles, but in fact between different, what is now called block builders. So basically between different auctions. So in MEV Boost, anyone could, construct a full block and basically send it to the validators. And this was a permissioned role still before MEV Boost. And after MEV Boost, basically, where previously there was only Flashbots making the blocks from the searcher bundles, now we kind of have between 5 and 10 different block builders who kind of share like at least a little bit of market share in this block builder market.
Thank you for that great summary. The era of MEV boost was a gradual one. At first, it was kind of Flashbots doing a lot of the block building, but over time, we saw the other builders expand and become very competitive. We also saw validators, home validators, start to pick up MEV boost pretty quickly, I would say. Looking at the ETH Staker and ETH Finance online communities, there was skepticism at first, but then honestly, it was the allure of the higher yields was fairly quick at naturally dispersing through the community and getting people on board. But then it was also, I would say, the adoption of, whereas we had mining pools for MEVGeth, liquid staking derivatives and MEV boost, and for MEV boost. So Steve Lido was an early adopter for all of their node operators. But then we also saw most of the major pools adopt it fairly quickly. Was that something you were expecting at the Flashbots team?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, we already saw the kind of preferences of the mining pools and the mining pool users as well in kind of MEV gap days, right? Where if you sourced searcher bundles and included them in your block, then you could make a lot more money. And this was long kind of the standard. And I thought that staking pools and like bigger node operators and especially home stakers as well would very quickly adopt MEV boost, and I think that's what we saw. I think it took maybe 2 months to get to like 80% adoption, so it was even quicker than in MEV gap days, which is not that surprising because like the idea of MEV extraction and kind of outsourcing the block construction had been much more kind of an established idea compared to the proof of work days.
Right, I fully agree. And I think we also saw a different cohort of users. As you said earlier, the mining community was a bit more nebulous, a bit more international, whereas the staking community seems, the fun word or the fun phrase, more Ethereum aligned. A lot of people who interact more with the core developers and run full nodes, so to speak. So I'm sure that helped that adoption as well. So now we have this essentially a proposer builder separation system, which is now being discussed for enshrinement. Before we get onto that, I want to bring up this problem. As Ethereum is expanding, we are building more and more fragmentation and complexity through layer 2s and through the complexification of the block building process. Do you think this can be resolved in a succinct manner, or do you think that there's some prescience to I'm forgetting his name, but he's the lead dev for Geth. I believe it was late 2021, early 2022. He tweeted out a short thread about the dangers of the growing complexification of Ethereum, and that the average end user is starting to lose understanding of how Ethereum itself works.
That was probably Peter Szilagyi.
Yep.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think he's spot on, of course. It's a problem that is important to keep in mind, that Ethereum is becoming more and more complex. It's not something that I think you can really prevent, because Ethereum is just like growing kind of alongside the kind of demands imposed by the market in many ways, right? So a system for example, it needs more scalability in order to meet the market demand from rollups and so on. It may need privacy. It may need things like account abstraction. It may need things like statelessness, and it may need things like proposer builder separation. Yes, you can design a system that's kind of very elegant and very simple, but it will come at the cost probably of like some usefulness, right? And I think in many ways, like Bitcoin is a good example, right? So Bitcoin's transaction fee demand denominated in Bitcoin is actually at a 10-year low right now. Like, this is an insane statistic if you think about it, that like the demand to transact on Bitcoin in its history has never been lower. And yeah, I mean, in many ways, it's kind of, the market moving past it in a way, right? And, due to the complete inability to kind of build on Bitcoin and, like, build useful things, whether it's issuing tokens, building roll-up construction, setting privacy, or even building things like, multi-signature wallets. So, I think in many ways, complexity is kind of like a natural cost of growing and keeping up with the market. And I think it's very important to keep in mind, so like we kind of remember to construct systems that also become possible to maintain and secure and audit and so on. And whenever we can remove complexity, I think it's very, very important. But it's also very difficult.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I mean, Ethereum is going to grow to the demands of the world. I think it sort of sits in the throne to be the world computer and global settlement layer, which will require it to complexify as much as it needs to make sure MEV and all the problems that arise can be solved or mitigated to the best extent. In the meantime, as we approach that, it's, I hope, the goal of some subset of the community to keep the node operators and validators and essentially the whole stack aware of the growth of the entire ecosystem. So in the vein, thank you for being here. I think that's what we're accomplishing here today. So next, I want to talk about the complexification of PBS through cross-chain MEV, expanding the domains we have available. Can you talk about some of the problems that imposes into the current systems and why Flashbots is thinking about SUAVE as a potential solution there? And generally, what is SUAVE?
Sure. So starting with cross-domain MEV, so we are now in an era where not all economic activity is happening on Ethereum. Rollups are starting to eat more and more of that share. And cross-domain MEV really is the idea that a proposer who can propose two domains at the same time can generate more MEV than a proposer who proposes only one domain. And this is relevant in many forms of MEV, for example, arbitrage, where someone might want to buy a token on one domain, and for example on Ethereum, and sell it on another, for example Arbitrum. And if you're just a searcher, then you have what we call here lagging risk. So this trade has two legs, and very similar to the bundle example that we gave earlier, if only one of your legs of your trade executes but the other doesn't, then you can incur a lot of financial risk for at least a short period of time. And someone who has the block ordering rights on both chains doesn't really incur this risk, right? They know what transactions they put into the block. And so they will never put one in unless the other also executes. And so the idea of cross-domain MEV was also outlined by Vitalik in his famous Endgame post, where he said, for many reasons, it looks inevitable that block production will centralize across many different chains. So it's very important to keep at least, validation of the chain, or verification, as we now say, I guess, keep that as cheap as possible for users, and have other kind of censorship resistance techniques. And I would say the principle for dealing with cross-chain MEV is very similar to all other forms of MEV. So you want to build a system that is open and decentralized, and that is competitive with a system that is closed and centralized. So when a single validator could basically make more money by, for example, sequencing Ethereum and Arbitrum, then you want to change you want to build an open system that has a similar property. So in this case, it would mean one of two things. So either you build a searcher marketplace that somehow can remove this lagging risk for searchers. And for example, shared sequencer could be one such idea, right? Or you build what is basically a cross-chain block builder or kind of cross-chain MEV marketplace that is itself decentralized. And that is roughly, I think, where we are going with the idea of SUAVE. So what is SUAVE? So I think to kind of understand SUAVE, you have to look at some of the current solutions in the MEV supply chain. So the MEV supply chain has some distribution of actors, block builders, searchers, relays, and so on, solvers. The infrastructure that all of these parties run is itself completely centralized and dependent on trust. And the consequences from that are that it's hard to trust for users. There are high barriers to entry for new market participants, and that in turn can hurt market innovation. There's very limited collaboration across the supply chain today, and that kind of drives more like scale economies to the already big actors. There's the risk, the legal risk from running important business logic on centralized servers, and that can really lead to also regulatory concerns, right? Like creating choke points for Ethereum in these like very centralized actors. And the solution that we see is to create a new system, a new blockchain that allows developers to build applications in a familiar environment, so Solidity, but to have to kind of allow them to run these applications off-chain in a way that is efficient and that is private and that is decentralized. So SUAVE is basically a new blockchain where you can run any MEV application, but as a smart contract in a way that's decentralized. That would be my kind of one sentence summary. And if you kind of zoom out a bit, then it's like SUAVE is basically a decentralized mempool. So it's kind of further democratizes this idea of the bundle, makes it available to everyone, and a block builder, because on the one side it takes in user preferences, and then on the other side it outputs blocks that can be proposed on various domains, not limited to Ethereum.
So that's a wonderful summary and very exciting. I'm curious about how does SUAVE discern what it's hooking into? For example, the idea of L2s and being able to settle from L1 to L2 quickly is itself interesting because the natural bridge has a 1 week delay. And I'm curious also if it's limited to smart contract platforms, or can it find intents from just fully centralized, like a centralized exchange? What are the limitations to SUAVE, and how is it aware of what it's hooking into?
So SUAVE, you can think about of it basically as a global bulletin board for preferences. So anyone who wants to change the state of anything in the world, they could post that preference to SUAVE. And then some other party can basically look at this, intent in a way that respects your privacy, and they can try to fill that intent. And if they do, then they can earn a transaction fee from you. And so SUAVE is not limited to smart contract platforms. So from the perspective of Ethereum or Arbitrum or Optimism and so on, it really, it works almost as a decentralized relay. So where you may connect to the Flashbots relay today, you would simply connect to SUAVE in the future. And as a validator or as a centralized rollup sequencer, you can query whatever is the most profitable block, that you can include now, in your next slot to propose. But it's also possible, that a sequencer or someone, like really anyone who can change the state of another domain, for example, on a centralized domain, on a centralized exchange, anyone who can basically change the state of that domain, they can also do that and then earn rewards from SUAVE. And in kind of the most extreme form, you can definitely imagine that centralized exchanges could outsource, for example, their matching engine to SUAVE. So I think in the future, I'm actually pretty confident that we're going to see something like that, because there's a lot of benefits for centralized exchanges to do that, right? Especially in kind of the light of so many exchange blowups and exchanges cheating against their customers, and also the rise of decentralized exchanges, which puts more and more pressure on centralized exchanges to also become more fair and more transparent. And so what you can do in SUAVE is you could rewrite your matching engine and your order book kind of as decentralized applications, where the state is also held kind of in confidential storage. And then, you basically make, you outsource the running of this matching engine and like of this order book to a blockchain, that keeps it private, makes it very efficient, but most importantly, makes it credible for users.
It's fascinating. I think there's already precedent for that kind of transformation. GDX, I believe, is the name of an exchange launched by some major legacy institutions that is moving towards the non-custodial system, where users hold their own assets and the trading just happens there. So a similar kind of process could totally happen with the trading execution engine, as you suggest.
The unbundling of exchanges over the next few years, I think, will be really interesting. Yeah, the custody angle and like the settlement aspect, I think, is also like another really fascinating one. It's not something that SUAVE kind of seeks to address, but it's definitely something that, as like someone who's interested in exchange microstructure and so on, I think is very fascinating to see.
Right. And also, it's going to give huge benefits to end users. Hopefully, we move away from these exchange blowups in this better system. So with SUAVE, one question I now have is, we seem to be handling MEV across all these domains with this neutral MEV layer, but how neutral is SUAVE itself? Is there not MEV within SUAVE? How is that dealt with?
Yeah, it's a great question. So SUAVE, transactions on SUAVE are encrypted to an off-chain execution network. And initially, we are using trusted execution environments, or TEEs, for that. So TEEs, that is a form of hardware that kind of has a secure enclave, and inside this enclave, you can run computation, or you can run different programs, and you can do computation on top of incoming data that is really credible and private, even from someone who kind of physically is standing next to that machine. Right? So so if you kind of do all of the computation inside these TEEs, then there's very little that, for example, a validator on SUAVE can do to extract any MEV from user transactions. And so that's kind of almost a prerequisite. So SUAVE is a blockchain, but it's very, very important to understand. SUAVE is not a layer 1 or a layer 2 blockchain in the sense that Ethereum or ZK Sync are, for example. It's a blockchain that its goal is not to execute or settle transactions. Its goal is to kind of build and aggregate and coordinate the transactions and bundles and blocks that then ultimately change the state of other blockchains. So it's a complement, right? And if SUAVE validators could extract MEV from transactions going through it, then SUAVE could not solve the MEV for these other chains. And so so solving MEV on SUAVE basically is kind of you have to kind of solve it like a priori. And yeah, we believe that we can do that initially through the use of TEEs, and then in the future also complement that with the use of fully homomorphic encryption, multi-party computation, and zero-knowledge proofs.
That's very fascinating. With the SUAVE network, as you say, it's not a traditional layer 1 or layer 2, and the mechanics of the network lend itself towards neutral MEV exchange. What powers do the validators then have? I'm guessing this is somewhat like a stateless system, so there can't be any errant state transitions, or is that wrong? Or what risks are associated with the validators here?
So the validators on SUAVE, I mean, they basically add blocks to the SUAVE blockchain. And what the SUAVE blockchain does is, it hosts different smart contracts. And so these smart contracts that then execute inside the trusted execution network. It also kind of serves in some cases to provide, to basically store data. So it's about giving data availability for these programs and for these applications that run off-chain. And the third component in the future, it will also be used to pay transaction fees, as well as kind of. So I was alluding to the idea that this you would basically have an intent of what you want to do somewhere in the world, and then if that intent gets satisfied, then SUAVE unlocks a transaction fee for whoever satisfied the intent, right? And so in order to do that, SUAVE needs to learn when an intent has to be satisfied. And so one thing that the chain will also do is it will import basically Oracle updates that describe the state of the outside world and make it basically knowable to the SUAVE system. And so, yeah, basically receiving and like posting these Oracle updates and then unlocking payments based on that. So that is the final thing that the SUAVE validators do. And one more word kind of on the data availability. So in general, I think so privacy is, or MEV really is kind of the number one use case for privacy in crypto. And I think it will really serve to kind of, harden and drive the application of different privacy techniques, because MEV cannot work without privacy. So if you can't have the privacy of bits and the privacy of computation, then you can't have efficient auctions, and you can't have division of labor, and you can't really return power to users. And so I want to emphasize like how really kind of amazing of an opportunity MEV is to kind of develop and drive privacy enhancement for crypto in general, and how you also get censorship resistance here as a side effect. Because for orders that are private, even if they are only private until the moment that they are included, then that still removes 99 point whatever percent really of the ability to censor a transaction. Because as a validator, you can really no longer single out any individual transactions. Like all you can do is kind of include no transaction at all, or like include all of them. And so yeah, privacy and like SUAVE, like while it's often seen as an MEV system, it's really also a censorship system, like an anti kind of censorship system at heart.
I myself am somewhat, unfortunately, an American, and many in the Rocket Pool community are as well. And there have been times where people have expressed their concerns about the regulatory regime and the fact that as proposers on blocks, they are in an extreme interpretation of the law, acting as financial transmitters or enabling financial services. So the ability to sort of default towards a system where they have no knowledge of the thing in which they are actually even proposing would help, I think, quite a bit for a good chunk of the population. As you said, censorship resistant would be something that we want. So one thing you also sort of imply is that censorship or privacy is a prerequisite for building an MEV neutral platform itself. One question I have is, do you think building an in-band solution to the problem of MEV is futile, or does it have to be this sort of out-of-band SUAVE layer through the relay, or can we change Ethereum, the base layer itself, to allow things like what SUAVE offers?
Yeah, so I don't think that you can change Ethereum enough to really give it anywhere near kind of the same guarantees that SUAVE can have. So there are some ideas for example, creating an encrypted mempool in Ethereum. But then, even if you did that, then like you would lose, for example, like let's say kind of the ability to also perform computation on top of that private data, which in turn gives you like access to all of these applications that run during the block building process, whether that's intent-based systems, RFQ routing, order matching, like count abstraction, bundling, like all of these things that today kind of make up the MEV supply chain and that drive a ton of value to users, you would lose access to these, right? So if you kind of go about like naively doing an encrypted mempool, because privacy is only one part of it. Like the other thing you need computation. So what you really need is not privacy, you need private computation. And SUAVE is uniquely designed to do that. Now, what do you like? You could, for example, like imagine, okay, like what if Ethereum fully incorporates SUAVE, right? Or SUAVE fully incorporates Ethereum, but like neither of these things make sense at all because the systems are designed for completely different things. And especially like it really makes a ton of sense for there to be a very clean division of labor between them because SUAVE needs to be very fast, needs to be very efficient, it needs to be private, and it also needs to connect like not just Ethereum, but also it needs to connect a lot of other blockchains. Because as we were alluding to, right? So if you want to make a block building system that can rival the biggest centralized block building systems, then you need to connect a lot of different domains in the same auction and the same block building process. Because that is what the best block builders are going to do, right? They are going to make blocks for many different domains at the same time, and they are going to buy up a lot of order flow from a lot of different domains, and that will allow them really to pay a higher price for this order flow because, I mean, this is really in many ways, for example, the key to why Citadel, can outbid other market makers for Robinhood order flow, for example. It's just the fact that, the more you buy, the more order flow you have, the more order flow you can match against each other, like almost in a cow swap kind of sense, right? You can have these coincidences of ones, and then the less you actually need to internalize against your own balance sheet and so on. And so, yeah, size in block building is going to be incredibly important. And so, so it's almost like, it's almost like a Lido situation in that sense, which is, and I know like you disagree and so on, but it's a situation where you just have huge returns to scale. And so you almost, in order to kind of build a system that can survive, you have to think, okay, how can I build a system that is actually really large, and it can have all of the order flow from all of the domains, and it can build like blocks for all of these participating chains and so on. And I think this is like this is a motivation for SUAVE to do that basically.
Yeah, I definitely echo the sentiments around the dangers of private order flow leading to centralization, and so being able to build a natural or neutral platform will take away those economies of scale. With the in-band approach, Barnaby from the Robust Incentives Groups put out a paper about PEPC, or Protocol Enforced Proposer Commitments, which aims to expand what the protocol can do and bring in this not full awareness of intents, but something more complex. If PEPC was implemented, it sounds like you believe it wouldn't be able to replace SUAVE, but do you think that it would be able to complement SUAVE, or are they somewhat separate systems in your eyes?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've been thinking about this. I don't have it fully kind of formalized in my head. So, I mean, the idea of PEPC basically says proposers can make commitments, to block builders and like downstream also users. And if you look at kind of MEV Boost today, then it's also like kind of a commitment system in a sense, because what the validator does in MEV Boost is they commit to including a certain block if the relay releases that block to them. And so they do that by signing the block header, and then the relay releases the body. And so you can think of PEPC as kind of almost like a generalization of that. And it would allow validators to make kind of more elaborate commitments, for example, like splitting kind of the auction and so on. But like ultimately, I think like one thing that's important to understand, like you can build PEPC in a very like centralized way, right? You can kind of do like, you can do MEV Boost, but you can like just upgrade it slightly, and you can have something like PEPC with like, instead of this one commitment, maybe you could have like another commitment, right? So for example, on top of like the regular kind of spot auction for blocks, you could also have a futures auction, where already today a proposer whose turn it is to propose a block in 10 blocks, they can already sell their block today. And they can also sell, that block to the relay, and then that relay can auction that block off to block builders. And that might be really interesting for rollups, for example, right? Who know they might be posting, a lot of data in like 10 blocks from now, and like a big proof, and so on, right? And so far, I think we haven't really seen a whole lot of use cases where it would actually be useful to kind of have more proposer commitments. Another example here is that, so it seems very logical that like as a proposer, you would love to have more agency over the block building process, right? So I think we saw that in, especially around like the time of OFAC, when proposers were saying, I really want MEV, but I don't want to censor Ethereum, right? And so, and I think at that time it was very clear, like this idea of the inclusion list. So a proposer basically has this list of transactions, and they send it to the relay, and then the relay sends it to the block builder. And basically the block builder is forced to include this list of transactions, or the block won't be valid, right? So this is, or like maybe it will be valid, but at least this certain proposer basically says, like, unless these transactions are in the block, I will not include it. But then when you actually go talk to validators, many validators, then you hear actually the exact opposite, right? So you hear, like whatever you do, don't give me more agency. And what's the rationale for that? So the rationale is basically that like the more agency you have, the more liability you have for the blocks that you make.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So and nobody basically wants to have the liability, for including, for example, transactions with North Korea. And so the more validators can argue, I just ran this default software here that everybody runs, it's called MevBoost. I just like used the default configuration. I sourced, the highest paying block. And I didn't even see what's in it, because I can't see, like I have to sign before the block is even shown to me. Like the more they can say that, kind of the more liability is removed. And that's very positive for keeping the validator layer decentralized. And so I think what I'm saying is agency is a really double-edged sword, and it's not really clear what something like PEPC would necessarily be kind of used for, at least in kind of the medium future.
I think another one of the concerns I have with PEPC is agency, while it also increases liability, also increases the areas in which a proposer can do something misaligned with their own incentives. with PEPC, we might also be introducing incentives to the base layer that we aren't comfortable with, or may not, or should not have put at the base layer, that can lead to centralizations that we just currently don't understand yet. So I do have reservations around PEPC just because of how local it is to the proposer level. Whereas something like a SUAVE being at its own independent point in the PBS timeline, uh, you have a little bit of separation there. And also with an eigenlayer where you have node operators opting into the secondary layer, you don't quite risk a change at the base layer that might have irrevocable long-term consequences. So how does that land with you?
Yeah. I mean, that lands pretty well, I would say, with me. I mean, in general, like, I think the more power you give to validators, like, you always kind of open up a Pandora's box where, you know, some validators may be using, like, they may have the ability to use that power better than others. You know, and then you introduce like new forms of centralization, and then ultimately what you do is you say, oh, like, okay, instead of validators picking their own like way to have to pick kind of their own way how to exert this power, let's outsource this to an open and neutral system. And then you just fold it like that into the definition of what MEV is, even, right? And so like at this point, you're basically saying, oh yeah, the relay or the builder should select like what are the best constraints on the block, right? And so one very popular, I think, the most valuable use case that I've seen for PEPC would actually be kind of the ability to like split the block auction into smaller parts. So, for example, one block builder would kind of build, you know, let's say the top of the block, and the other would build the bottom of the block. And so, you know, why is this attractive? You know, it would basically be, you could argue, well, there's a lower barrier to entry to building like smaller parts of the block, right? And so you make a more competitive builder market, and like ultimately leading like to more money for the validator. I think in practice, like, you run into a ton of problems with that, with like no builder having kind of, you know, the information of the full block when building the block and so on. And ultimately, like, the relay needs to merge these then, and then really just like the relay becomes the builder. But yeah, so I think there's some arguments. I forgot actually where I'm going with this. I thought
the block separation was interesting for the sex-dex arbitrages. It just turns out the top of the block ends up predominantly being arbitrages against centralized domains. So splitting that out and to be more profitable long run.
Yeah. So I mean, I think this could be an argument like to do it, but what I would respond is actually, you're right that like the top of block is all sex stacks up, or like dominated by it, but would the sex stacks arbitrageurs actually use a kind of, you know, like a system where they only build half the block? I think they would not, because they basically get to build the bottom for free right now. So why would they leave that to someone else, right? So it's basically like, you know, asking someone to give up a lot of power, which I think is unlikely to happen.
Yeah, it's an interesting take. I think it would be more equitable, but it would be hard to manage. So that just about summarizes the questions I had for you today. Thank you for giving us such a wonderful rundown on the history of MEV, your own roles at Flashbots throughout it all, and sort of like the near future of what it might look like for Ethereum. Actually, one final question. Could you give us some brief timelines or expectations around when we might be seeing SUAVE live on Ethereum, or any other alpha about the near future of Flashbots?
Oh, sure. So in Q4, we will see a DevNet for SUAVE. So we already published, we're actually going to see a public testnet. So we already put kind of a DevNet out like a couple of weeks ago, so anyone can download and run, you know, MEV Gav, or SUAVE Gav as we call it now. So and so you can go, you know, github.com/flashbots/SUAVE-gav, and you know, go see the client there and all of the technical documentation. And so, yeah, sometime in Q1, early next year, we're looking to kind of launch the mainnet version of the first version of SUAVE. And what this has is basically, so going back to this original definition that we had, it is a blockchain where anybody can develop any MEV applications as smart contracts, and they can outsource the running of these applications to a third party. The one difference is that this third party in the beginning will basically be Flashbots and other centralized parties who will run this for you. So what it will not yet be, it will not yet be decentralized and private. So for that, we are looking at the next version of SUAVE, which will come in 2024, which will feature this off-chain execution network of trusted execution environments. So to summarize, testnet in Q4, and then mainnet in Q1 or Q2, and then the second version of SUAVE, which is developed in parallel, so it's not really kind of contingent, will also be released in 2024, and that will have privacy and credible execution.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that timeline on what we can expect. Our host, Nick Ashley, Bav, has a bit more to say and some information, some alpha about Rocket Pool. So make sure you stick around for that. But thank you again, Hasu, for joining us.
Yeah, Jasper, Nick, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, bye.
Yeah, I'd like to give a big thanks to Hasu as well for taking the time to chat with us today. Also being accommodating with the scheduling. I've always maintained that to really know a topic, you have to be able to explain it to other people. And I think that has been demonstrated over the past hour and a bit. I personally have learned a lot. In terms of what Jasper was referring to, if you missed the first bit of the call, some of this maybe repeats, but there are still some interesting and exciting news, or as we like to call it in Rocket Pool, bread, coming up in the next couple of weeks. So starting out big, we do have a couple of ecosystem integrations that should be announced this week. And we are talking some pretty significant household names. So that's something you might want to keep an eye out for. And that is on top of our prep work for Friday, when a contingent of 6 of us will be jetting off to Singapore. Unfortunately, Joe is stuck in the US, holding down the fort, as it were. We will have a booth at ETH Singapore, so if you're there, come and say hi. There should be some of us floating around, but there are also a ton of meetings lined up. And that stretches through Token 2049, a Digital Asset Week, and also a brief side trip up to Kuala Lumpur. And then after Singapore, well, I'll be straight into planning. We have Istanbul and Denver coming up, and then we're also trying to squeeze in maybe 1 or 2 more events, which will be good. I'm just going through these in rapid fire because the call's already gone on for a little bit, and I think next week on our community call, that'll be a great opportunity to discuss all of these items in more detail. The new website, if you've been following along that for the last few months, that's almost complete. Obviously, with all of us being in Singapore, that's going to push it out a few weeks, but it does have some really nice design work created by Sleety, who's here in the audience, I see. And then that will kind of enable the start of our new marketing and comms strategy, which of course I'm personally very excited about. And this is all with a slightly less orange than you may be used to. Langers and Dave are still working on the promised roadmap article. So that should be live on Medium. Again, we're looking post Singapore. And speaking of Langers, I do also have the Staking Rewards YouTube channel up, and his panel is still going. A little bit of an overlap there, but if you want to tune into a panel, I believe it's about LST collateralized stablecoins. That has been going for the past 20 or so minutes, and you should be able to catch the end of it over on the Staking Rewards YouTube channel, or of course linked from the event section in the Rocket Pool Discord. I think that's about it. Thanks also goes to Jasper for hosting from his new X account. Make sure you give that a follow. And then, of course, a big thanks to everyone listening in the audience. We do these spaces every week. Usually there's a guest. And of course, next week, as I mentioned, that'll be a live report from Singapore. So make sure you tune into that. It should be a pretty big call. And yeah, hopefully catch everyone then. And see you later.
Cheers, everyone. Bye.